Good evening. We're about to start. There are still people who may come in late. I'm going to ask you, if you see seats in your row that are kind of in the middle or farther down, start scooching down from this end so when people come in, they can kind of sit over here without having to climb over people. We'd appreciate that a lot. This is kind of like at the movie theaters where you make you, we ask you move. The good thing is I don't think there's a bad seat in the house tonight. Good evening. I don't know if every teacher could say the first day of class, if people, quiet down in their classroom as quickly as that. That was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, and welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia's 2023-2024 speaker series. This is the kickoff. It is our welcome back to school night, so it is so wonderful to have all of you here. I am Beth Hessel, the Executive Director of the Athenaeum, and it is lovely to see so many of our members and friends and neighbors gathered together to learn together. I want to say welcome again. Beautiful, friendly, historic, stimulating, welcoming, community, oasis, serene, historic library. These are just some of the words that our members used in a recent member survey to describe the Athenaeum. Our inspiring building certainly contributes to creating that atmosphere. But even more so, it is our staff and our members, our board, and others in the community who are committed to supporting the work we do as a library, as an event and programming space, as a community that nurtures our intellectual curiosity and wonder. It is all of you who support us through your gifts, through your volunteer efforts, through your participation in our many programs who make the Athenaeum what we all know it to be. So I want to thank you for creating this community. And if you are brand new here and you are just experiencing us for the first time, whether you borrowed a pencil from me, or to take your notes, or you found out through Will Bunch's article about this event, we're so glad you're here, and we invite you to become a part of this community. Attend more programs, join us, use our circulating library, find your seat in the library to start writing your next novel. We would love to have you as a part of the Athenaeum. Now, tonight's a special moment because we celebrate our annual literary award winner tonight. In 1949, the Athenaeum established a literary award to honor books published in the calendar year that were of outstanding merit and that were written by Philadelphia area authors. We have since expanded that to include books that focus on the city of Philadelphia. Winners are chosen by a panel of Athenaeum shareholders who serve voluntarily, reading scores of books and meeting regularly to deliberate. The committee evaluates each book on its literary merit and quality, and every year at our annual meeting, we announce the winner after announcing shortlist finalists earlier in the year. In recognition of his role in establishing the literary award, presentations are usually part of the Charles Wharton Stork Memorial Lecture Program, which was endowed in 1983 by his children. So we are grateful to Dr. Stork and his children for our ability to have this free program tonight and the reception. Dr. Charles Wharton Stork was a writer, a poet, a philanthropic member of our community, and a member of the board of directors of the Athenaeum from 1919 until 1968. Now, I'm delighted tonight to welcome one of the members of our awards committee, Kathy Moses Shelton, to introduce our award winner. Kathy.
Good evening. Tonight I have the distinct pleasure of introducing the winner of the 2022 Athenaeum Literary Award. It goes to Will Bunch for After the Ivory Tower Falls, How College Broke the American Dream and Blew Up Our Politics, and How to Fix It. Will Bunch is a veteran political journalist and recipient of numerous awards, including sharing a 1992 Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on a deadly subway crash at Union Square for New York Newsday. He is the national opinion writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer and is senior writer for the Philadelphia Daily News. He's the author of 2 previous books on politics. The first, Tear Down the Myth, How the Reagan Legacy Has Distorted Our Politics and Haunts Our Future, and The Backlash, Right-Wing Radicals, High-Def Hucksters, and Paranoid Politics in the Age of Obama. In his latest book, After the Ivory Tower Falls, Bunch asks and answers questions about the future of the university in the United States today and how it can move forward toward a more equitable manner. After the Ivory Tower Falls stood out from the competition for its timeliness and its importance to its society. The book is briskly written with great clarity. It's enlightening and delivers a solution to a thorny problem. Now I'm sure you'd like to hear from the author, Will Bunch. Will?
Wow, thank you so much. I'm so flattered so many of you turned out tonight. I mean, it's kind of crazy. I actually was, this morning I said, oh my gosh, I better go online and tweet or X or whatever we call it these days, one more time about the event so I make sure people come. And I did that, but then I clicked on the link for the event and I saw that it was sold out. And I'm like, first of all, I didn't know a free event could get sold out, but it's kind of an oxymoron, I guess, or something. But I'm so grateful that so many of you came out, especially because when I won the award, they asked me if I could come speak in September 14th. We picked as a date, and I said, well, that's great. And then last week I realized it was the same night as the Eagles' home opener, and if I'm grateful to you, I'm even more grateful to the Athenaeum for scheduling this at 6 p.m. So anybody who is so inclined can not miss the kickoff, which is fantastic. I mean, while I'm being grateful, I'm just so grateful to the Athenaeum for this award. If you've seen a list of the award winners, it's kind of a who's who of modern writers in Philadelphia, and I'm not sure if I actually belong on that list, but I'm just so flattered and honored to be on it. And I'm honored to be speaking here because as most of you know, I mean, this place has been around since 1814, which is just incredible, and the history here. And if you are here for the first time, check out some of the amazing things they have here. It's really great. So, so what I'm gonna do tonight is I'm gonna give, I think a pretty short. I think Kathy said my writing was brisk. I think the speech is also going to be brisk to some degree. So, but the reason I did that was because I was hoping a lot of you would have questions, and that we'd have kind of a healthy and perhaps long question and answer section, because I'm going to in my talk I'm going to talk mainly about the themes of the book. But as some of you know, as national opinion columnist for the Inquirer, I write a lot about what I guess you would call the current political situation, and I know that's on everybody's mind, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about the 2024 presidential election, for example, and what's going on with that. I know some of you probably have a few thoughts about that, so I'd be happy to answer that. But let me put on my reading glasses, and I've got my hat here, which I don't have an Eagles hat, unlike Danilo Cavalcante. I don't have any Eagles gear with me, but I've got my Phillies hat, so I figured go Philadelphia. So regarding the book, the book really kind of cuts to the core of, frankly, of why I became a journalist and a writer, which was a long time ago. But my thinking was, if I was going to do this, I really wanted to investigate the big questions. And my main focus has really been on politics. I was a poli-sci major in college. I write mainly about politics for the Inquirer, and I've been writing about politics for a long time, going back to the 1984 presidential election was the first one I covered, so that's a long time. So to me, now that we're in the 21st century, it felt to me like the big kahuna of political questions was this one: why are Americans so bitterly divided? And especially now, because there's not a world war, and by some measures, there's relative prosperity in the country. Yet, increasingly we live in a nation where we see every election, both Democrats and Republicans see every election as kind of an apocalyptic battle for the soul of the nation. And I think a lot of people consider it a catastrophe if their son or daughter marries somebody from the other party. I mean, that's where we're at these days, right? A few of you might know that I'm a somewhat left of center guy, so I knew that would get a few chuckles. But so early in the 2000s, I became slightly consumed with trying to understand what motivated people on the other side, the right of center. In fact, I did probably the craziest thing that people in this room could imagine, which is I started listening to Rush Limbaugh. Back then, I was a parent, and I was working these kind of strange split shift hours to help raise my two kids, who at that time they were in grade school. Now they're about to turn 29 and 31, so it's kind of crazy. But during all those hours I spent in the car as a parent driving them around, I listened to a lot of talk radio. And the thing about it was, I totally got why mostly white working class folks out in the heartland were so angry. Manufacturing in America had been devastated. Their jobs had been outsourced and shipped to China or Mexico. But what struck me was that the callers weren't mad at the millionaire or billionaire CEOs who laid them off. Instead, their vitriol was directed at people like Hollywood movie stars, or college professors, or journalists, especially journalists. People like me, the professional managerial class. People call it PMCs. It didn't make a lot of sense to me, but I really felt that what motivated all this right-wing grievance was a hatred of all things collegiate. And over the next 15 years, I watched kind of in amazement as this notion deepened. By the mid-2010s, the greatest predictor of how a person in America votes is whether or not they went to college. Democrats were becoming the party of people with diplomas. Even as Democrats said they were going to raise taxes on their higher incomes. Meanwhile, the GOP was now the party of the non-college white working class, even though Republicans sought to deny them health insurance or any other government benefits. Increasingly, cultural animosity trumped, emphasis on the word trumped, common sense. And the sense that people disliked or distrusted college as an institution turned out to be prescient. As recently as 2015, the year that a certain presidential candidate came down the escalator at his marble palace, a majority of Americans told pollsters that they had faith in higher education in this country. And just 8 years later, those numbers have plummeted. Today, the approval rating for college in America is just 36%. That's ahead of journalists and used car salesmen, but just barely. Democrats, generally dislike how much college costs. Republicans, almost all of them, just hate college on general principle. So I finally decided to write after the Ivory Tower Falls, kind of in the nadir of the Trump years. At that time, I definitely knew the questions, but I didn't know the answers. Some of you might remember when Nancy Pelosi famously said about Obamacare that we had to pass the bill to find out what was in it. It was kind of the same for me. I had to write this book to find out what was in it. It was clear that college attainment was a thing that was driving Americans apart. So there had to be something about college itself that was causing this. And it turns out that basically, when you get down to it, there's two simple questions that have kind of defined the story of college in America, which are who gets to go and who pays for it. For me, like growing up as a baby boomer, college and the American dream were synonymous. It was an idea that started with my grandmother, who was a whip-smart woman who never got the chance to go to college. She was born on a cattle farm in rural Missouri in 1907. And yet, by force of will, she ended up creating a small college, a small private college herself that was called Midstate College in Peoria, Illinois. And so college was just kind of central to the history of my family. My dad was the first person on that side of the family to get a college degree. And I was the first person in the family to attend an Ivy League university. And that was I thought that kind of summed up what the American dream was at that time, which is that a kid is going to do better than his parents. But somewhere that dream kind of hit the rocks. I think one of the things I didn't appreciate when I was coming of age in the 70s and getting ready to go to college was that we were living in the shadow of a great accident of American history called the GI Bill. At the start of World War II, only about 5% of Americans had a bachelor's degree. Most people didn't even graduate high school at that time. In figuring out what to do with returning veterans, Congress, in passing the GI Bill, threw in this remarkable college benefit. Returning veterans got free tuition, even if you went somewhere like Harvard or Yale. They paid the whole bill, plus books, and you got a living stipend to rent an apartment or whatever. And one of the reasons they did this was they didn't think that many people were going to take advantage of it because they frankly thought that most American youth weren't college material. And boy, were they wrong. The kids of the working class, and these were, to be honest, these were mostly white men for complicated and what I think most of us would agree now are unfortunate reasons. But these kids proved them wrong. In fact, they ushered in what I call the golden age of college in America. College enrollment kept rising even after the GI Bill kind of wore off. Eventually it increased sixfold in little more than a generation. And many of these kids attended a growing network of public universities that were just sprouting up across the countryside everywhere. During that time, America never fully made college like a taxpayer-funded public good, which is, if you think about it, it's the way we do K through 12 education, right? That all taxpayers pay for K through 12 schools, even if they don't have kids or their kids are grown up. We didn't do that with college, and that would prove over time to be a very consequential decision. But during those years, however, tuition was kept incredibly low, and some colleges, like the University of California or City University of New York, were free. Tuition was free, which is incredible. And also at that time, there was kind of an ethos around higher education, which was that in the shadow of the Great Depression, World War II, now the existence of the nuclear bomb, that going to college would make for better citizens, that it would produce generations of enlightened, critical thinkers. Doesn't that notion seem kind of quaint today? So why did this golden age have to end? Well, it didn't, yet end it did. And the main ugly reason for that, in my opinion, was it was mostly politics. In the 1960s, which looks like a few people in this room remember the 1960s. I'm just going out on a limb. Sorry about that. I remember them. I was born in 1959. So, in the 1960s, this generation of critical thinkers fixed their gaze back towards the United States of America and its hypocrisies, our hypocrisies over racial segregation in the South or the somewhat inexplicable war in Vietnam. The ensuing campus protests energized a conservative backlash, which feared that the existing social order was being threatened. And the leader of that backlash, maybe you've heard of him, a guy named Ronald Reagan. In 1966, Reagan won an upset victory as governor of California by railing against the student unrest at Berkeley. And then after he won, he famously proclaimed, quote, "Taxpayers shouldn't be funding intellectual curiosity," which when you think about it, was a total 180 from what the philosophy had been. In 1970, which was, some of you also probably remember, was the year of bloodshed at Kent State and also at Jackson State University, a Reagan advisor said the quiet part out loud when he wrote in a newspaper op-ed, quote, "An educated proletariat? That's dynamite." Like we couldn't have a smart middle working class in this country. He said, quote, "There are some people who shouldn't be attending college." So the notion of higher ed as a public good was dead or was dying, and the era of college privatization was underway. Now, I have to confess that when I wrote this book, I didn't fully understand what it meant when people said that college today is privatized, because, I always thought quote, privatization, unquote, meant that waste management was picking up your garbage instead of city workers, and it does mean that, but in the case of higher ed, it basically means that the cost of college doesn't fall on the broader society or all of us as taxpayers, like it does, again, for your kids' middle school, but instead it falls on you or your family or your parents. And the Reaganites, who increasingly drove policy in the 80s and 90s, argued that the benefit of college was that you were making a personal investment in yourself. So that even if you had to borrow money to pay for college, it was a great investment because the higher income that stems from your bachelor's degree was going to make it all worthwhile. The thing is, privatized college also meant that tuition started rising sharply. And that was partly because of the lousier economy that arrived in the 1970s, but it was also partly because conservative state legislatures started underfunding these universities, a trend that would accelerate over time. Unfortunately, this happened at exactly the same time that the bottom dropped out of the post-World War II blue-collar economy. The increasing urgency of a college diploma to remain in the middle class started to put families in a bind. The increasing reliance on loans to pay for higher tuition meant the rise of a student loan industrial complex in America. And eventually it led to what I would call the vulture capitalism of for-profit universities. Like if you remember the Art Institute of Philadelphia, which doesn't exist anymore, that was an example of one of these for-profit schools that sprung up everywhere, especially in like around the 2000s or so. These schools were like a vampire squid because they learned how to max out a young person's student loans while minimizing their actual education. So it's no wonder that the approval rating for higher education is only 36%, because the state of higher education in the United States today is a mess. Student debt has risen to about sorry, I do that every page. Student debt has risen to 1.75 trillion. That number just always blows my mind. It's more than Americans owe on all of our credit cards. Meanwhile, our public universities are, for the most part, so grossly underfunded by their state governments that increasingly they have turned to trying to lure upscale, party-seeking out-of-staters or else kids from China or other foreign countries who are able and willing to pay full out-of-state tuition. But when you think about it, that's an abandonment of the reason that these colleges allegedly exist, which is to educate the young people of their own state at a reasonable cost. But they're not doing that. They're doing, they're looking out of state to tread water. Some of the things that they do to attract these students, they've got into this kind of amenities arms race, people call it, where they build these luxurious food courts with, steak dinners and all kinds of fancy restaurants and gyms with crazy rock climbing walls, and some universities down south have these lazy rivers like you might see at a hotel in Las Vegas, where people can float around the campus on a raft all day, and I'm sure they're doing their English literature homework at the same time. But yeah, it's crazy. But that situation is just getting worse and worse. I don't know if any of you have been following it in the news the last couple of weeks, but there's a funding crisis right now at the University of West Virginia that's led to massive layoffs and the elimination of entire programs like foreign languages, advanced math. And this is in an Appalachian state that's desperate to bring its young people out of poverty, and instead it's kind of an unconditional surrender. And also, I think one really important part of the death of the American way of college is what I would call rampant careerism. And so what do I mean by that? This was probably, to me, like the most fascinating statistic I unearthed when I was researching my book, which is, in 1969, when public universities were ridiculously inexpensive and back when humanities majors were still at their peak, a whopping 82% of first-year students told UCLA's annual nationwide survey that the chief purpose of college is, quote, to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. And only a small number responded with, quote, career preparation, unquote. But as quickly as the 1980s, those numbers had completely reversed, and they never looked back. Career prep has always been an important part of the college experience, and it should be. Of course, people need to prepare for a career. But we aren't talking enough about what we lose when that becomes the only part. So what happens when you tell people that college is the American dream, only to crush it, which is what we've done, basically? Well, one thing is that it changes our politics dramatically. You certainly see this in the movement of young people on the left. The student loan crisis was a huge driver of the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, and it helped lead to the subsequent rise of Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders as a national figure, and the growing acceptance among young people for socialism and related ideas. But despite that, arguably the bigger impact has been the rise of resentment and grievance politics on the right, so much of it directed towards our college-educated class. Not that long ago, conservatives fretted that college campuses were too liberal, and they called for changes like hiring more professors with right-wing views. Those days seem kind of quaint now. Today, extreme right-wing governors like Florida's Ron DeSantis or Texas's Greg Abbott aim to boost their profile in the GOP, not by reforming college, but by destroying it. For example, DeSantis and his minions in the Sunshine State engineered a right-wing takeover of the state-run New College of Florida, a small college that until recently had put, quote, the liberal in liberal arts. And what's happening after this takeover is you had a thriving community of what you might call queer students or students who, think and live differently, and most of them have already, in less than a year, have been driven out, and the school's philosophy is to replace them with, no offense, because I played a lot of sports in high school, but with jocks. It's basically that they're trying to boost their sports teams at the expense of kids who believe in alternative lifestyles or who want to study the humanities. Meanwhile, down in Florida, they've endangered tenure and college accreditation. They've passed laws that have terrified professors about what they can say in their classrooms about topics like race or LGBTQ plus issues. And they've created a new spirit of McCarthyism. The totally predictable result is that a whopping 47% of Florida college faculty told a recent poll they are planning to seek new positions in a different state. In Ron DeSantis' Florida, it's not just that college isn't the American dream, it's that it's becoming a nightmare. In writing my book, one thing I did was, I tried to focus a lot on how our decisions, increasingly bad decisions about higher ed policy and the like, have affected everyday people. So in the book, I profiled the 1970s era Penn grad whose bewilderment over the growing radicalization on the right and the echoes of the Holocaust that had affected her own Jewish family caused her to become a pillar of the so-called Trump resistance. I talked to a laid-off worker from outside Scranton whose belief that Democratic elites looked down on him drove him into the arms of Donald Trump. I profiled a 20-something man from South Jersey who wanted to attend Temple and become the first person in his family to get a college degree in the worst way. And arguably, he did that. He and his family ended up racking up $180,000 in debt. And that's a little unusual, but it's not that unusual. I mean, I have talked to multiple people, both in this book and just for the reporting for the Inquirer, who have six-figure college debt. It's really not that unusual. And I also talked to a mom from Bucks County whose two eldest sons didn't attend college and who died deaths of despair from suicide and from a drug overdose. And the point of that is, we need to understand that the crisis of college in America isn't only involving the young people who attend college, it's also for the young people who don't get that opportunity, who get shut out. One of the things I made sure I talked about a lot in the book is that, while and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself maybe, but while I support the idea of, free or almost free public universities, that we really should be doing the same thing with trade schools, that we need to have pathways. I think one statistic that's so central, and I think a lot of people don't actually know this, is that the number of people in America who have a bachelor's degree, or the percentage, is about 37%. So that means almost 2/3 of Americans, 63%, don't have a bachelor's degree or a four-year degree. Now, a lot of them have some college, either community college, or they went for a couple of years, and because of the cost, probably they dropped out or whatever. But that's the reality. And so, we're not going to fix the political divide just by giving people free college. We need to think about solutions that take into account the whole wide range of Americans. And that's kind of what I argue in the last part of my book, is that it doesn't have to be the way it is. I think most of us agree right now that the biggest problem facing America is the political division that's threatening our very democracy. And it's making people speculate about a, quote, civil war, unquote, without sounding like an insane person for talking about it. But when it comes to doing something about this great divide, we tend to freeze like deer in the headlights. I mean, the truth is there is no overnight solution, But if the roots of this problem are tied to some of these mistakes that we made around education, so must be the solution. Our failure to make college a public good was a huge mistake, but that doesn't mean we can't start to rectify that error. A nation that currently spends more money on its military than the next 9 nations combined, and that's also constructed a school-to-prison pipeline. And by the way, I should note, Pennsylvania, where we live, most of us, is one of 17 states that spends more money on prisons than on its public universities. So, I mean, I just found that to be appalling when I found that out. But we did those things at the same time we were slashing funding for universities. But if we readjust those priorities, then we really can work towards making, public higher education, our main public universities, where so many of our young people attend, make them free, or at least nearly free like they used to be. Meanwhile, I would argue the baby boomers and older who currently run America, and maybe some of us in this room know some of those people, can and should acknowledge that a whole entire generation, or a couple generations really at this point, have been screwed over by the whole student loan situation, and we should find a way to forgive those loans. I truly believe, and I also think we really need to change our mindset about college, that it isn't merely to prepare people for a career, but it's also to create the new generation of critical thinkers who are going to save our democracy. And as I point out in the book, the consequences of downgraded education in America have been dramatic, because what started for some as resentment of college has morphed into resentment of knowledge. And that means increasingly an anti-democratic mass movement on the political right has embraced conspiratorial thinking, including the so-called big lie of massive fraud in the 2020 presidential election, which has been thoroughly debunked. Meanwhile, distrust of elites, including the nation's scientists, like Dr. Fauci, for example, caused millions to reject the public health regime of COVID-19 vaccines or wearing masks, and we may be dealing with that all over again. Thousands have died needlessly, and a new wave of the virus could mean more heartache to come. Meanwhile, despite a long, hot summer of record floods and killer wildfires, America continues to lead the world in climate denial, perhaps the ultimate middle finger to the knowledge regime of science. I think to solve this, we're going to have to do some real thinking outside the box. So in the final chapter of After the Ivory Tower Falls, I really pushed the idea of making a government-backed gap year as close to universal as it can be for America's 18-year-olds. The advantages of such a program would be enormous. There'd be a surge of civilian public service to help improve America around issues like climate change, infrastructure, bettering schools in some of our disadvantaged areas. But more important would be the less tangible benefit of having young people from different backgrounds, our red states and our blue states, rich and poor, urban and rural, Black or white or brown or Native American or Asian or whatever, to have people coming together for a common purpose. And without the violence of what used to cause that effect, which used to be war, which we don't want that, but we can do positive, civilian service. And that's not an instant solution, but if we don't start planting the seeds of knowledge and critical thinking and respect for learning in our young people, it's going to be a long, barren season for the American experiment. So that's why I think it's so important. So anyway, thanks so much. I hope you have a lot of questions, because we have time to answer a bunch of them. So. Yeah, I'll start in the back. You in the back, right?
Yes. There are tectonic movements that you cite, like the GI Bill, and these very
Yeah, well, you touched on about three major things there, so I'm not sure. No, that's good. No, so I'm just gonna say I'm not sure which of all those to answer because, but I do think one super important point you hit on was what you said about coming out of college as a well-rounded student who could think, who has skills in subjects like English or writing, because one of the great tragedies of what we've done to higher education in this country is, we've created such a focus on skills and it becomes so career-oriented. And then these kids go out into the job market, and a lot of employers are saying, this isn't actually what we wanted, because for one thing, as we all know, we live in a time of such rapidly changing technology. I myself have been a journalist for over 40 years, and the tools we used and the way we did things 40 years ago are kind of like caveman stuff compared to having to know how to do social media or take pictures with an iPhone or all the things that we need to do today. And so you want critical thinkers who can adapt. And the social sciences and the humanities, they're a part of that. Those are subjects that teach people to become critical thinkers, and it's a shame we've ignored that. And also the one other point you made about, you're absolutely right. We can't, when we talk about what's gone wrong with college in America, we can't ignore the role of college administrators. I'm surprised you didn't also mention the point that on top of all that, a lot of them are kind of overpaid as well, and it's given conservatives who don't like college generally such a great talking point, because they can point to these overpaid administrators, and they certainly have a point. And there's a lot of administrators, and some of that is because we're trying to deal with problems that we should have been dealing with before, like sexual harassment, for example, is one where colleges have had to add administrators to deal with that problem. They should be doing that, So, but that makes it more expensive. It's a very complicated formula, and one thing in this book is I didn't try and get ultra specific about what I think colleges or the system should be doing, because first of all, we have people with PhDs in education who write about those things, and I'm not one of those. But also, I think we're not going to solve any of these problems unless we change our overarching mindset, and that starts with the mindset of how we see college, whether it's a public good or a privatized good, and until society agrees that, higher education is as essential now as K through 12 education became essential 75 or 100 years ago. And we really, if we change our mindset and I think realize that all of society benefits from higher education and should be supporting it, then we can start drilling down on some of the more specific solutions. Right, I'll go from the back to the front. So.
Seems like there is a crisis in every single situation, like yours and like ones that each of us have thought and agonized about. I admire what you've done to have written such a book. I could never do that, but what I've done is a real crisis on the SEPTA system, which 29 different bus lines
I've heard about that. I appreciate your question, but I'm also good.
One other issue is the toilets. That in public places, if we don't get more toilets in public places, we're going to have diseases.
I can't.
Nuclear war.
Those are all so important, and the only thing I can really say and add to that is that all of the problems that you mentioned, we need to be producing critical thinkers to solve them. So that's who's next. Yes, you. Yeah. Yeah, that's right, yeah. A little, yeah.
You mentioned that there 47% of Americans have college degrees. Are there places that we can look to? I think about the first universities in Germany and Italy and eventually in England. Are there models that are better? Are countries producing more graduates? I know China, there's universities of 30,000 where there was nobody 5 years ago in China. I've done some work there. I just wondered what you've seen around the world that might be good models.
It's complicated. One thing is, for all the things we've done wrong, in terms of the actual education you get, a lot of people still consider the United States the gold standard, right? Which is why so many people from these other countries want to come here. So that's one thing. Thankfully, we haven't screwed up as much. But one thing that really struck me when I look at Europe and what's different about the European model. Two things really stood out. I mean, one, and it's kind of obvious, is the cost of college is much lower in Europe, and in some countries it's close to free. I mean, there's always going to be some costs or fees or living expenses, but I think in Denmark you can actually even borrow money for your living expenses, and then tuition is free or whatever. So that's a huge difference. But the other thing that people don't think about is, in Europe, there's kind of more status and prestige to not being a college graduate because they have such a strong trade worker system there. And if you are a trade worker or a blue-collar worker in a European country, you get more vacation time, you get government health care, you get things that blue-collar workers in America ridiculously do not get. And as a result, you don't have as much resentment. There's not as much for tradespeople to resent. It's just a different choice. It's just that's kind of the way we want it to be, right? It's like, well, I don't really want to go to college. I want to learn to be a plumber and be an apprentice for a couple of years and do that. And you can do that and make a good living, take 6-week vacations, have status in society. That's something we don't do right in America.
Those countries have much more general education about politics in their countries.
Yeah, because they still adhere more to the idea of knowledge for its own good, and not just careerism. I think that's the third leg of that. So thank you. You with the mustache.
Could you talk a little bit more about the associate professors that primarily teach in the colleges as opposed to research professors?
Yeah, or not even associate professors, but the reliance on adjunct professors, which I tried that myself actually for a couple of semesters at Temple. I was an adjunct professor in journalism, and it was so much work for I forget the first time I did it. I think I got paid $3,600 for a semester, and the second time they'd given people a raise, and it was like $4,200 or something. And it was an incredible amount of work, especially because I was doing a class where I had to kind of create my own curriculum. But I mean, I don't know why I'm going on about my experience, but because my experience was kind of normal. I mean, that happens all over the country, and that's it's funny you asked that question, because that's actually, like, if I have any regrets about the book, and a couple people, the biggest bulk of people I think who read my book since it came out a year ago have been people in higher education, professors or people who work in colleges. So I have a lot of people read that book, and a few of them are like, how come you didn't talk about adjunct? And I didn't really get into that in the book, because my book, I really focus kind of more on the student perspective of college than on the faculty perspective. But the adjunct thing is a very real crisis, and it's all part of the same thing, which is the privatization of college, and trying to save, when the bottom dropped out of funding college for various reasons, something had to give, and one of the things that had to give was these professors who were entitled to huge salaries getting supplanted in a lot of cases by these adjuncts, many of whom are good and dedicated, but it's a very complicated system. So, yes, you in the black.
Previously, you talked about trade unions in Europe and their people like
I haven't researched it a lot. One thing that I think is interesting, though, is I think that, you know, for all the animosity that exists right now between a lot of working class folks, particularly the ones who are voting Republican these days, and college educated elites, people in unions, you know, union leaders and union members are very supportive of higher education. They still very much adhere to the model in the 50s and 60s, which is, you know, the American dream that I talked about of college is doing better than your parents. You know, a lot of union people, they want their union to offer a college benefit for their kids to help them pay for the ridiculous high tuition. You know, I'm kind of, one thing that I devoted some attention to in the book, and I'm kind of obsessed with this whole thing. In fact, I might go there and give a talk next May, but you know, I'm very obsessed with what happened at Kent State in the years leading up to the student massacre there. And there's a whole aspect to the Kent State story that gets about the lead up to that, which doesn't get told, which is that the kids who were attending Kent State and who were protesting the war in Vietnam, these were almost all blue collar kids. I mean, Ohio at that time was dominated by the auto industry. Kent State is very close to Akron, which was still like the tire making capital of the world back then. And these were all the kids of union members. And for one thing, that's where they got their liberalism from their parents. You know, they weren't rebelling against their parents. They actually, it's interesting, they actually got their liberalism from their parents, who were union activists during the Great Depression in some cases. And I think one of the reasons you had this backlash that was led by Ronald Reagan, or also to some degree Richard Nixon, who I didn't mention earlier, but that you had this backlash is they were terrified, again, the whole idea of an educated proletariat, like that guy said, you know, the idea that these working class kids were getting smarter and were going to use that intelligence to upend the social order, terrified the establishment. And that really explains a lot of what's happened to higher education over the last 50 years. So that's a good question. It's a very complicated interplay. All right, I'm going to go all the way to the back. That's you, yeah. That's it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, I'm gonna answer your second question first, because the crazy thing is the Philadelphia Daily News. I bet 10% of the people, if that many in the room, know this, but the Philadelphia Daily News still exists. It's still published six days or 5 days a week, and I don't know, 7,000 or 8,000 people read it, and it's interesting. And so basically, all of us who used to work for the Daily News were absorbed as staff writers for the Inquirer, and we're branded. You know, we tell people we're from the Inquirer. We're branded as being the Inquirer, but our articles get relayed out in tabloid format and get published in the Daily News. And I think there's some diehard people out there, you know, cops and hospital workers stopping at the Wawa on their way to work, who just have the habit, and we know that if we stop printing the Daily News, they would give it up. So, and the other thing is, I think they think people like me who worked at the Daily News would have a fit if they ever killed it. So they're probably humoring us by keeping it in business. So, your question about the nonprofit, I mean, I think there's no question that I find, frankly, it's not just universities. I think a lot of nonprofits kind of abuse their status by overpaying their top executives. You know, I won't mention a certain radio station in this town, but some you know, there was it's not exactly a university, but there was an article in the Inquirer, and I guess in the Daily News yesterday about I think it was the Penn medicine system paid its CEO a higher salary than it's given to charitable causes in the last 3 years. That's wrong. I mean, that just shouldn't be. And being a nonprofit is no excuse to pay people overinflated salaries. And I totally support the idea that a place like Penn should be making payments into the school system. There's no, given the amount of money that flows through that institution, there's just no excuse for it. So that was a great question, thanks. We have time for one more? Okay. You. Okay, thanks. Yes.
From your perspective, who runs a university now? Is it the president, is it the board, is it the state legislature, and what is the involvement role of the board?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously it varies at the different types of institutions. I'm glad you asked that question because I've become very interested in that myself. Even after I finished writing the book, and it came out, the hardcover edition came out in August of 22, so it's been out for about 13 months ago. But since the book came out, in the last academic year that just happened, not this new one, but the one that just happened, I became very fascinated with the situation at Temple University here in Philadelphia. And I don't know if that motivated your question to some degree, but Temple's that's why it's about universities being different. Temple's kind of an odd duck. It's this, what they call a state-supported school. So the state gives it money that's supposed to be used to lower the tuition of kids from Pennsylvania, but not other kids, but they don't get as much money as some of the other public universities might get. And their board has public members, but it has a majority of private members. And these people, and I wrote about this in the paper last year or earlier this year, they're business people. They're capitalists, not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but they're capitalists with a capital C, and they look at higher education with that perspective, and not the public good, not the humanities perspective. And that whole fiasco with the president who didn't work out at Temple was kind of a result of that short-sighted thinking by the trustees. On the other hand, in a lot of states across the country, and as you might imagine, not to pick on Republicans or anything, but especially in red states, governors who are the people who tend to pick the trustees for the public university systems in North Carolina or Wisconsin or Florida have just totally politicized the system and basically pick their big donors and people who support the Republican philosophy. And a lot of the problems, and I mentioned in this speech portion, I mentioned what's going on in Florida, and a lot of that is driven by these right-wing trustees who've been appointed to these boards. So I think the crisis has reached a level where people are paying attention to university trustees, and I'm hopefully that there'll be some reforms, hopefully, of that system, because it's one of the many things that need to be reformed in the way we do college in America. Well, you've been great. I wish I could have answered everybody's question, but the good news is I'm sticking around. I'll be signing some books for some people, hopefully, and then there's a reception afterwards, and I'll be hanging around. I might miss a few downs of the Eagles game, but that's okay because I want to meet you. So thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks so much.
Thank you to Will Bunch, to our Literary Award. Would our Literary Award Committee members who are here tonight stand up, please, just so people can see who did all the hard work of reading so many books. Thank you. Head House Books are selling books up here. If you brought one, you can get it signed as well. The reception is in the reading room right across the hall. We hope you'll stay and enjoy a glass of wine and good conversation and buy a book for yourself or for someone you love. Thank you.